Total darkness blotted out the sea, and it became cold and damp. Timothy took the shelter down, and we both pulled our shirts and pants back on. They were stiff from salt and felt clammy. The wind picked up, blowing fine chill spray across the raft. Then the stars came out. We stayed in the middle of the raft, side by side, as it drifted aimlessly over the sea. Stew Cat rubbed his back against the bottoms of my feet and then curled up down there. I was glad because he was warm. I was thinking that it was very strange for me, a boy from Virginia, to be lying beside this giant Negro out in the ocean. And I guess maybe Timothy was thinking the same thing. In the early 1990s, Warner Brothers was gearing up to start production on a film based on the autobiography of Malcolm X, a project that had been in development hell since the 1960s. The director attached to this project? Norman Jewison, a white man. Never mind the fact that he was a highly acclaimed director of films like Rollerball and Moonstruck. Never mind the fact that he had directed numerous films about racial tension, including A Soldier's Story and one of the most groundbreaking films of the 60s, In the Heat of the Night. Never mind that because of his last name, Jewison was mistaken for Jewish in grade school and was bullied because of it. Never mind all of that. The important part was that a white man was going to do a film about Malcolm X. That wasn't going to stand with passionate African-American filmgoers and filmmakers, and the resulting protests saw Norman Jewison step down from the project and replaced by African-American director Spike Lee. Now, in fairness, Jewison himself said he was never satisfied with the script and wasn't sure he could make the film work. And in fairness, Spike Lee's Malcolm X is pretty damn great. This isn't about what could have been, and it certainly isn't a cry of reverse racism, but rather an example of a tricky situation you can find yourself in when a person from Group A creates a story about Group B. Even trickier when a person from what is considered a more privileged group of people creates a story about a less privileged group of people. And perhaps at its most trickiest when a white person creates a story about black people. It's this creative conflict that's at the heart of The Cay, a children's novel by the late Theodore Taylor, published in 1969 and dedicated to Martin Luther King. The story tells that of Philip Enright, a young white boy aboard a naval ship that is sunk by German submarines in the middle of World War II. He finds himself adrift with an elderly black West Indian man named Timothy, and due to injury, winds up blind just before the two of them came across the titular Cay, the studio apartment of desert islands. There they have to learn to survive with minimal food, limited supplies, and a coming storm. As you no doubt have sussed out, Theodore Taylor is white, and that book description I just gave you probably did your image of this guy no favors. A kid stops being racist by going blind? That's about as obvious a metaphor as you can get, removing the visual spectrum to show, hey, underneath it all, we're all just the same. Well-meaning or not, it's a kind of sentiment so cheap to almost be insulting. It's one acoustic guitar away from this.
Spacemen came down to answer some things. The world gathered round from paupers to kings. I'll answer your questions, I'll answer them true. I'll show you the way, you know what to do. Who is wrong and who is right? Yellow, brown, black or white? The spaceman, he answered, you no longer mind. I've opened your eyes, you're now colorblind. Racial, so...
But even without such a cheesy metaphor, The Cay found itself in a conflict of whether or not it was actually a positive betrayal of race. The book was published in a period when children's literature was being taken very seriously, by which I mean all the boring books that people thought were good for kids got a shiny round sticker put on its cover. Of course, there was the Newbery Award, which some consider to be the highest honor you can bestow onto a piece of children's literature, while others see it as a warning sticker that this book is pretty dismal and either a beloved pet or a young child is going to die in it. And after the Newbery came, a bunch of offshoots and wannabes, like the Randolph Candlecott Medal for picture books, the Golden Kite Award, in which the books are judged by the author's peers, and beginning in 1953, the Jane Addams Children's Book Award. Jane Addams was a social activist in the late 19th century focused on world peace and women's suffrage, and the award that bears her name is awarded to those books that promote peace and equality. And in 1970, that award went to Theodore Taylor and The Cay, and then was promptly taken back. The main objection towards the book was the portrayal of Timothy, that he was a stereotype who was subservient even when the only other character around was a small child, even constantly calling Philip young Bush. He was superstitious, and he spoke with what many would call a comically exaggerated Creole dialect. I asked, "What is your name?" Hearing my voice, he turned with a wide grin. "Ah, you're back with me. You have been lonesome these very hours." I repeated, "What is your name?" "My own self? Timothy." "Your last name?" He laughed. "I have but one name. 'Tis Timothy." It's not quite Jar Jar Binks, but it is distinct and for some people most certainly distracting. So we have a book written by a white man near the end of the Civil Rights Movement, right after the assassination of Martin Luther King, to whom he tributes this book. A book that has an obvious and corny metaphor in its message of equality, a book whose only colored character is a funny-sounding servant who takes care of a sick white boy on a desert island, a book that was given an award for promoting equality and then had the award taken away when the people behind it actually bothered to read the thing. By all accounts, The Cay is just a clusterfuck, right? Are you kidding me? The Cay is great. No, seriously, I really like this book, and I think it's a lot more subtle, interesting, and, yes, more intelligent on the subject of race than my description of this point has led you to believe. First off, let's talk about Theodore Taylor. Now, we've all heard the old saying, write what you know, which is usually bad advice because most people don't actually know anything worth reading. But Taylor is one of the exceptions. During World War II, he served as a cadet on a gasoline tanker, then as a naval officer in the Pacific Theater. He participated in Operation Crossroads, the testing of atomic bombs in Bikini Atoll. He was then recalled to active duty during the Korean War. Not only was Taylor familiar with war, but the transitionary periods in the 20th century when the glories of war slowly began to tarnish in public eye until finally crumbling completely in the Vietnam War, which we were in the middle of when this book was published. It should be no surprise that the early chapters have a very heavy focus on the World War II setting. Taylor's writing style goes for a lot of straightforward facts, a lot of names and dates with minimal descriptions. At times it comes off like a history book. But within that context, Taylor paints the events of World War II as frightening and oppressing, a time when metal war machines loomed like monsters. The opening paragraph goes on to describe German submarines as silent, hungry sharks that destroy everything that cross their paths, hiding in a dead sea. It's a kind of confusing, horrific scenario that has the character of young Philip boasting patriotically about the American Navy to friends one minute, and him hiding a hatchet under the couch in fear of evasion the next. This is a child on a precipice, about to lose his foundation on knowing how the world works, with the final push being the moment of violence that results in him blind and on the Cay with Timothy. The book positions Philip so that it's not just his views on race, but his entire worldview that is about to change dramatically. The racial politics in these early chapters come from two small scenes. The first is a moment when Philip and a friend are running around some docks and come across some black locals on shipping boats and pretend they're pirates, and the locals have fun with it. The other is when we learn that Philip's mother is very verbally racist. It presents a time prior to the Civil Rights Movement when racism was much more commonly present, with adults speaking their racist opinions without a second thought. And it's of a time when black individuals were largely anonymous in the lives of white people. It's not exaggerated racism, but a very realistic racism that forms part of that worldview that's about to be shattered for Philip. And Taylor was wise to make the point of view character a white person. I would agree that had the point of view character been black, Taylor would have been out of his element. Despite being younger than Taylor would have been at this time, Philip's descriptions of this war-torn world comes from Taylor's own experiences, a cautious nostalgia if such a thing exists. And that's why I feel Theodore Taylor was justified in telling this specific story. If he tried to write this stuff from the point of view of a character whom he bears no life experience, it could easily have been poorly handled. It's for that reason that I hesitate to read Timothy of the Cay, the prequel/sequel book Taylor wrote in 1993. But of course, Taylor did not get stranded on an island with a black man and go blind, so there's still plenty of wiggle room for fucking it up. Take that metaphor for example. Blind equals no more racism. Well, I don't think that's what's actually happening here. Or at least, I think it's far more complicated than that. Usually this kind of idea revolves around a character not being aware that they are interacting with a person of color. If the white character is not blind, then the colored person is usually obscured in some way, and then they take off the mask, and it's a big shocking reveal, and you have to reevaluate everything that came before that. The Cay doesn't bother with that kind of stuff. Philip spends a significant amount of time with Timothy before he goes blind, and it's not like he forgot Timothy was black. Even when blind, just the way Timothy talks and acts is a constant reminder that Timothy is a very different person from Philip, and no amount of blindness can remove the cultural and class divide between these two characters. Now, I don't think Philip's blindness is a metaphor at all, but a handicap that makes the desert island scenario all the more dangerous, and Philip's eventual victory over these challenges all the sweeter. It's not Timothy that Philip can no longer see, but the Cay itself, his new world. We never actually get a visual description of it, just estimates from Philip's remaining senses. This meant that Philip was effectively having to construct his new world view from scratch, both being forced to rely on his other senses in new ways, and learning about this new world that he has to survive in. I find this incredibly effective, and even more so after I saw the 1974 television adaptation starring James Earl Jones and one of the lesser Bad News Bears. The film has problems, though for what it's worth, James Earl Jones is giving it all here, despite playing a character that was 30 years older than he was at the time.
There is nothing to fear here. I walk around the whole island. There is nothing but sea grapes, sand, a few little lizards, and those palm trees. A nice fat langoust for dinner.
Yeah, look at that frail old man. You know he's old because his hair is bleached white. So all those positives I just brought up, not in the film. We don't have any of that stuff establishing the wartime setting. This movie could literally have taken place at any time. Philip's uneasy relationship with the world isn't established, and we don't get any glimpses of wartime racism. We open immediately with the ship getting torpedoed by a submarine, and the opening credits play over Philip and Timothy on the raft. Philip is no longer the point of view character, at least not much of a character at all here, and played by a pretty bad child actor to boot. And now we can see the Cay. We are as removed from Philip's headspace as possible, and without all that, all we're left with is James Earl Jones babysitting a handicapped kid. It's a really boring film. Okay, but what of Timothy himself? Is the character a stereotype? Was it right to have him talk that way? Well, that's a tricky question, and perhaps the one I'm not entirely qualified to address, as I have very little knowledge on Creole stereotypes. Here's what I can say. First, Taylor claims that Timothy was based on a real person he knew, and considering the level of detail in the book that clearly came from Taylor's personal experience, I want to believe him. Second, Timothy is not a subservient character to Philip. He calls him young boss in the beginning, in keeping with his formalities of his position as a black sailor, but that doesn't stick for long, and Timothy is not a wise old Uncle Remus type. He's not a magical Negro, but rather a tough-love substitute father figure who realizes his own frailty and has to teach Philip how to care for himself should something happen to him. He's sometimes harsh, he has flaws, and he even slaps Philip at one point. Uncle Tom characters don't slap the blind, privileged white boy. And his accent? Well, again, tricky, because trying to communicate a foreign dialect through text can come off as over the top. In this case, if it is or isn't, is probably going to be up to the individual reader. But for me, I'm with Theodore Taylor in his response to this criticism. Would you rather him give Timothy a Brooklyn accent? Because sure, you'll want to stay away from stereotypes, but to even out Timothy's accent to play down his more superstitious attitudes and his habits from his longtime career, that's not being culturally sensitive. That's cultural whitewashing. This is not fighting racism by recognizing the differences between people and understanding that these differences do not make any of us a lesser person. No, this is fighting racism by trying to make colored people more white. Theodore Taylor makes no attempt to whitewash his colored character, and that makes all the difference here. So yes, The Cay is a book in which everything that could have gone wrong did not in fact go wrong, and it remains a very strong book aimed at young adults. As we move forward and our relation with race continues to evolve, it is important to understand the struggles of those less privileged than ourselves, and it is important to completely understand where we each individually stand on these matters. Theodore Taylor managed this. The Cay is a good book because of this, and we're all a little richer for it.